Welcome. You found a quiet corner where the echoes of the past can gently settle around you. Here, we unravel history's forgotten threads, the curious tales, the overlooked moments, the whispers of lost eras. This is a sanctuary for the curious mind, for peace in learning, and a gentle path to stillness. Let these quiet histories guide you to calm. The 100 Years' War, a deep chronicle of unprecedented conflict and transformative change. 1,337-1,453. The retrospective label, 100 Years' War, barely scratches the surface of this colossal, intermittent, and profoundly complex struggle that spanned an astonishing 116 years. From 1,337 to 1,453. Far from a singular event, it was a tapestry woven from overlapping wars, tense truces, intricate diplomatic maneuvers, devastating internal conflicts, and profound societal upheavals. It acted as a crucible, refining the very essence of medieval statecraft, revolutionizing military doctrine and technology, shattering long-held social hierarchies, and ultimately forging the distinct national identities and centralized political structures of what would become the modern nation-states of England and France. To truly comprehend its immense historical weight, one must embark on an exhaustive exploration of its deeply intertwined political, economic, social, military, and cultural dimensions, understanding that it was a conflict lived, endured, and shaped by multiple generations. The deep roots of enmity, centuries of feudal entanglement and economic rivalry. The animosity that ignited this protracted conflagration was not a sudden eruption, but the culmination of centuries of complex Anglo-French interactions rooted in the very structure of medieval feudalism. The foundational paradox lay in the Norman conquest of 1066. When William, Duke of Normandy, seized the English throne, he became a sovereign king. Yet for his vast ducal and communal lands on the European continent, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Poitou, etc., he remained, crucially, a feudal vassal to the French crown. This created an inherent and irreconcilable conflict of loyalties. An English monarch, supreme in his island realm, yet simultaneously a subordinate to a foreign sovereign for his continental possessions. This intricate feudal web, far from a stable arrangement, was a perpetual source of friction, a legal and political Gordian knot that generations of diplomacy and occasional warfare failed to untangle. The strategic marriage of Henry Plantagenet, later Henry II of England, to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 dramatically escalated this tension, creating the colossal Angevin Empire. At its zenith, this sprawling dominion controlled more French territory than the French king himself, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. This vast rival power posed an existential threat to the Capetian dynasty in Paris, inspiring a long line of French kings, notably Philip II Augustus, to systematically reclaim these English holdings. The most significant French success came in 1204 with the conquest of Normandy from the ill-fated King John, a profound humiliation for England and a pivotal step in France's territorial consolidation, though it did not entirely sever the English link to the continent. The subsequent Treaty of Paris, 1259, between Henry III of England and Louis IX of France, attempted to provide a lasting settlement. Henry formally renounced his claims to Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Poitou, in exchange for retaining the wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, Gascony, as a feudal dependency of the French crown. This seemingly peaceful resolution merely transformed the nature of the dispute, as the English king's continued obligation to render homage for Gascony remained a festering wound and a constant pretext for French confiscation if feudal duties were deemed unfulfilled. The precise nature of this homage is often debated. English kings preferred liege homage, which implied mutual loyalty, while French kings pushed for simple homage, which implied unquestioning subservience, further illustrating the fundamental disagreements over sovereignty. Beyond these intricate feudal obligations, powerful economic imperatives relentlessly pulled the two earthly powers towards conflict. The wine-producing region of Gascony was of immense economic significance to England, providing vast quantities of high-quality wine that fueled a hugely profitable trade centered on cities like Bordeaux. French attempts to assert greater administrative and judicial control over Gascony directly threatened this vital commercial artery. Simultaneously, the wealthy textile towns of Flanders, encompassing parts of modern Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, with their booming wool and cloth industries, were inextricably linked to England, relying heavily on stable imports of English wool for their thriving looms. The English crown, through its control of wool exports, wielded significant economic leverage over Flanders. French attempts to bring Flanders more firmly under their suzerainty often provoked fierce resistance and outright rebellion in the Flemish cities, which invariably sought English support and protection. This created a powerful Anglo-Flemish economic political bloc that directly challenged French authority in the Low Countries, adding another volatile layer to the Anglo-French rivalry. Furthermore, control of the vital English Channel was paramount for both trade and military projection. Ongoing skirmishes, piracy, and the imperative to protect merchant fleets, e.g., the Cinque ports in England, underscored the strategic importance of maritime dominance even before formal declarations of war. The chronic problem of privateering and piracy in the Channel, often sponsored by both crowns, further inflamed tensions and provided a continuous backdrop of world-level conflict. The immediate catalyst that finally ignited this centuries-old conflict was the Capetian succession crisis of 1328. The direct male line of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 300 years, unexpectedly ended with the death of King Charles IV without a male heir. This triggered an unprecedented dynastic crisis. Edward III of England, through his mother Isabella, daughter of Louis IV of France, and sister of the last three Capetian kings, presented what he considered an irrefutable claim to the French throne. He was the closest living male relative by blood. However, the French nobility, deeply reluctant to accept an English king, invoked the ancient Salic law, a Germanic legal code from the 6th century, arguing that succession could not pass through the female line, even to a male heir. This interpretation, conveniently championed by the French jurists of the time, such as Pierre de Cumières and Jean de Saint-Romain, served to legitimize the claim of Philip VI, a cousin of the deceased king, thereby establishing the House of Valois. For Edward III, this was not merely the denial of a throne, it was a profound repudiation of his dynastic right and an unbearable insult to his perceived legitimate lineage and royal status. His formal assertion of the French crown in 1340, following Philip VI's provocative confiscation of Gascony in 1337 due to English alleged infractions of feudal duties, transformed long-simmering tensions into open, declared warfare, unleashing a torrent of blood and iron upon Western Europe. The French confiscation of Gascony effectively nullified the Treaty of Paris, giving Edward a direct casus belli. The Edwardian War, 1337-1360, the Longbow's ascendancy and France's humiliation. This initial phase was fundamentally characterized by a series of stunning English victories that shattered medieval military orthodoxies and demonstrated the revolutionary effectiveness of new tactical approaches and weaponry, particularly the longbow. The war began with sporadic raiding and declarations, but the decisive early blow came at the naval battle of Sluys in 1340. Here, an English fleet, personally led by Edward III, utterly annihilated the combined French and Genoese fleet in the Zwin estuary off the coast of Flanders. The French ships, often converted merchant vessels, were packed with soldiers but lacked the maneuverability and archer firepower of the English. The English deployed a cunning tactic, linking their ships together with grappling hooks to form a continuous floating platform for their archers, effectively turning the naval engagement into a devastating land battle at sea. The English secured command of the Channel for decades, ensuring unimpeded passage for troops and supplies, and definitively quashing French invasion threats against England itself. This mastery of the seas was a crucial logistical and strategic advantage throughout the early phases of the war. The land campaign that followed culminated in the legendary Battle of Crécy in 1346. Edward III, leading a smaller yet highly disciplined and tactically innovative English army, around 12 men, including a significant contingent of Welsh longbowmen, found himself strategically positioned on favorable terrain. A gentle slope with a marshy flank that protected his left and forced the French into a narrow approach. The English deployed their forces in 3 divisions, or battles, utilizing massed ranks of longbowmen on the flanks of their dismounted men, at arms, who formed a solid defensive corps. These archers, often drawn from the English and Welsh yeomanry, were highly trained professionals capable of firing up to 10-12 arrows per minute, a rate of fire unmatched by the slower, less flexible crossbows of the Genoese mercenaries employed by the French. The French, estimated at 30 men, were disorganized, their commanders arguing amongst themselves, and their initial charge was piecemeal. First waves of the Genoese crossbowmen, lacking pavises, large shields for protection, were quickly cut down by the relentless English arrow storm. Subsequently, successive charges of the proud French chivalry, hampered by their own disorganization, narrow formations, and the difficult, muddy terrain, reportedly churned by rain and cavalry, were cut down in swaths before they could even effectively close with the English lines. Many knights dismounted to attack, only to be bogged down and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of arrows. Crécy was a catastrophic, almost unbelievable defeat for the flower of French nobility, with thousands of knights, including King Philip VI's brother and the King of Bohemia, perishing. It unequivocally demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional heavy cavalry charges against disciplined, missile-armed infantry and shattered the myth of chivalric invincibility. It was a profound psychological as well as a military triumph for England, signaling the new age of warfare. Following Crécy, Edward III shrewdly capitalized on his momentum, laying siege to the vital port city of Calais, 1,346-1,347. The year-long siege was a brutal test of endurance for both sides, involving extensive engineering works, including a fortified new town built by the English to house the besiegers, a huge logistical effort to supply the besiegers, and the eventual starvation of the town's inhabitants. The legendary story of the burghers of Calais who offered themselves as sacrifices to save their fellow citizens but were spared by Queen Philippa highlights the human drama and desperate measures of the siege. Calais became an English stronghold for over 2 centuries, until 1558, serving as an indispensable strategic bridgehead for future English expeditions and a critical hub for cross-channel trade, a constant reminder of French humiliation. A dark and unforeseen interlude, however, dramatically reshaped the course of the war, the arrival of the Black Death, 1347, 1351. This devastating pandemic, a cataclysm of bubonic and pneumonic plague, swept across Europe, causing immense and unprecedented depopulation, with estimates ranging from 30 to 50% mortality across both England and France. The plague indiscriminately killed peasants, nobles, and clergy alike, leading to widespread social and economic disruption. Manorial systems faltered as labor became scarce and expensive. Fields lay fallow, trade routes were disrupted, and traditional hierarchies were challenged. The sheer scale of the demographic collapse temporarily halted major hostilities, as both kingdoms grappled with societal breakdown, severe labor shortages, and widespread despair. This forced hiatus, ironically, served to prolong the overall conflict by giving both sides time to recover from their losses, albeit at an unimaginable human cost, reshaping the economic landscape of Europe and laying the groundwork for greater social mobility. Hostilities resumed, culminating in another stunning English victory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. This time, an English army of around 7,080 men, led by Edward III's charismatic and militarily gifted eldest son, Edward, the Black Prince, Prince of Aquitaine, achieved a decisive victory over a much larger French force of possibly 15,020 men, personally commanded by King John II. The Black Prince's strategy involved a chevauchée through French territory designed to provoke a battle and capture plunder. Employing similar defensive tactics to Crécy, utilizing rough terrain, hedgerows and vineyards, and relying on the devastating power of their longbowmen, the English again decimated the French. The French, in a tactical blunder, dismounted many of their knights for a frontal assault across difficult terrain, making them vulnerable targets for arrows and subsequent close-quarters combat. The French attack was delivered in piecemeal battles, allowing the English to concentrate their fire. Crucially, during the chaotic battle, King John II was captured, along with many leading French nobles, a profound and unprecedented humiliation for France. His capture plunged France into even deeper political chaos, weakening the regency government led by his young son, the Dauphin Charles, later Charles V. This power vacuum and the crushing burden of high taxes levied to pay for the king's enormous ransom, 3 million gold écus, equivalent to 2 years of French royal revenue, combined with the widespread devastation from English chevauchés, destructive mountain raids designed to terrorize, plunder, and provoke battle by destroying crops, villages, and infrastructure, and the perceived failure of the nobility to protect the populace, ignited the savage Jacquerie, 1358, a massive, brutal peasant revolt in northern France. The peasants, driven to desperation, attacked castles and massacred nobles, demonstrating the extreme social tensions. Though ruthlessly suppressed by the nobility, often with the aid of English mercenaries like Robert Knowles, the Jacquerie underscored the deep social fissures and widespread suffering caused by the prolonged conflict. Simultaneously, in Paris, the Etienne Marcel uprising of the urban bourgeoisie, advocating for greater parliamentary control over royal finances, further destabilized the Dauphin's authority, demonstrating a wider discontent with royal governance. These internal French crises, though brutally put down, bought the English more time and leverage. The Edwardian War concluded with the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. This treaty represented the zenith of English power and influence on the continent. In a significant diplomatic maneuver, Edward III formally renounced his claim to the French throne. In exchange, he received full and absolute sovereignty over vast territories in southwestern France, including an enlarged duchy of Aquitaine, encompassing Poitou, Limousin, Périgord, Quercy, Rouergue, Agenais, and parts of the Angoumois and Saintonge, and the vital port of Calais, critically, without any feudal homage to the French king. This effectively created an independent English principality on French soil, estimated at roughly 1/3 of the kingdom's territory, along with a massive ransom for King John II. While seemingly a step back from the direct claim to the French crown, it fundamentally transformed English control over a substantial, strategically vital, and now entirely independent domain in France. This phase ended with England holding significant territorial gains, but France was reeling from military defeats, the capture of its king, pervasive internal rebellion, and the lingering shadow of the Black Death. The Caroline War, 1369-1389, French resilience, strategic rebirth, and the mercenary scourge. The second major phase of the war witnessed a remarkable French resurgence, largely orchestrated by the strategic genius of King Charles V, the Wise, and his brilliant and cunning constable, Bertrand du Guesclin. Charles V, unlike his impulsive father, was no battlefield commander but a shrewd statesman, an astute administrator, and a master of patient, calculated strategy. He meticulously analyzed the English strengths and French weaknesses, learning from past catastrophic defeats. His reign marked a conscious and intelligent shift in French military and political doctrine, focusing on grinding down the enemy rather than seeking decisive engagements. Charles V explicitly forbade his commanders from engaging the English in large-scale pitched battles, recognizing the English longbow advantage in such encounters. Instead, he adopted a new, cautious, and highly effective strategy of attrition and exhaustion, avoidance of decisive engagement. The primary directive was to deny the English the opportunity for another Agincourt or Crecy. French forces would shadow English armies, cut off their supplies, and harass them rather than engaging in open combat. This frustrated English attempts to provoke battles. Systematic siege warfare. The focus shifted to methodically besieging and recapturing English-held towns and fortresses. This required immense patience, strong logistical support, and a growing expertise in military engineering to construct siege engines, undermine walls, often using professional miners, and starve garrisons. This was a slow, expensive process, but it yielded lasting gains, slowly eroding English territorial control. The French developed better techniques for sustained blockades and the use of early gunpowder weapons in sieges. Scorched earth tactics. French forces frequently employed devastating scorched earth policies, burning crops, destroying mills, and poisoning wells in areas through which English armies were likely to pass. This denied English armies forage and provisions, forcing them into difficult and costly logistical operations, making them vulnerable to disease, especially dysentery, and gradually exhausting their resources and morale. This tactic was brutal for the civilian population, but strategically effective in making vast swathes of land inhospitable to invaders. Guerrilla warfare and harassment. Bertrand du Guesclin, the Eagle of Britain, became a master of cunning and irregular warfare. Leading small, mobile, and highly disciplined forces, he launched surprise attacks on isolated English garrisons, supply convoys, and foraging parties. His intimate knowledge of the terrain, his use of ambushes, and his disciplined approach slowly but surely wore down English morale, depleted their manpower, and exhausted their financial resources. This systematic harassment eroded English control over the countryside, reducing their gains to isolated garrisons that became increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. Du Guesclin also excelled at capturing castles through cunning and bribery rather than costly assaults. Charles V also understood the critical importance of maritime power. He invested heavily in rebuilding the French Navy, utilizing a combination of royal ships and hiring Genoese and Castilian galleys. This revival was crucial as England's reliance on sea lanes for communication with Gascony grew. The combined Franco-Castilian fleet, Castile being a crucial French ally due to shared animosity towards the Black Prince's rule in Aquitaine, decisively defeated an English fleet at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372, crippling English naval power and reopening French access to the Atlantic. This victory further diminished English control of the Channel and opened the way for destructive French raids on the English coast, including attacks on towns like Rye, Hastings, Portsmouth, and even the Isle of Wight. These raids brought the war home to England, sowing terror, contributing to public discontent, and further draining royal finances for coastal defense. Through this patient, methodical, and often relentless approach, the French systematically recaptured almost all the territory ceded to England at Bretigny. By 1375, English holdings in France had been drastically reduced to a few coastal enclaves in Gascony, around Bordeaux and Bayonne, and the vital port of Calais. The sheer cost of maintaining English garrisons and sending expeditionary forces across the Channel proved unsustainable in the face of French resilience and tactical ingenuity. The economic model of the chevauchée, while initially effective for plunder, became less tenable as France developed better defenses and refused battle. The English war effort was further hampered by profound internal challenges. The deaths of the highly capable Black Prince in 1376 from prolonged illness, likely dysentery, contracted during his campaigns in Spain and Aquitaine, and King Edward III in 1377 left the throne to Edward III's young and inexperienced grandson, Richard II, aged 10. Richard's reign was immediately plagued by significant domestic unrest, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, fueled by grievances over heavy poll taxes to fund the war, labor shortages after the Black Death, and deep social inequality. This revolt, though brutally suppressed, underscored the deep social fissures and widespread suffering caused by the prolonged conflict. Richard II's own autocratic tendencies, his preference for peace over war, which alienated many nobles, and his attempts to curb the power of the high nobility led to further internal struggles, culminating in his deposition by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV in 1399. These internal English conflicts severely diverted royal resources and attention away from the French conflict, allowing the French to consolidate their gains without significant English intervention. The chronic issue of free companies or routiers also became a major problem during this period. These were large bands of demobilized mercenaries and soldiers who, with no war to fight or lords to serve, turned to banditry and pillaging throughout the French countryside during periods of truce. They extorted ransoms from towns, destroyed crops, and terrorized the populace. Both English and French kings struggled to control them, and their existence further exacerbated the suffering of the civilian population, making truces almost as devastating as open warfare. Charles V famously tried to export these companies by sending them to fight in Castile, supporting Henry of Trastamara against Peter the Cruel. This demonstrated a pragmatic approach to dealing with social disorder caused by demobilized armies. This period gradually faded into an extended series of truces, driven by the mutual exhaustion and immense financial drain of both sides, and the pressing internal problems each kingdom faced. Richard II, genuinely seeking a lasting peace, even married Isabella, the young daughter of the French King Charles VI, in 1396, a union that briefly cemented a two-decade truce. However, the political instability in England, culminating in Richard's deposition by the Lancastrian usurpation, ended this period of relative peace and set the stage for renewed and even more brutal conflict. The Lancastrian War, 1453, English Apex, Joan of Arc's Divine Spark, and the ultimate French triumph. The final and most dramatic phase of the war began with a renewed, aggressive English campaign that brought them to the very brink of conquering France, only to witness a profound and improbable turning point that ultimately reshaped the destiny of France. After a period of relative peace marked by internal English instability, the Welsh revolt of Owain Glyndwr, the Percy Rebellion, Henry V ascended the English throne in 1413. A charismatic, deeply pious, and militarily brilliant monarch, Henry was determined to revive England's claims to the French crown and secure its continental dominance. He expertly exploited the ongoing and devastating French Civil War between the rival factions of the Armagnacs, loyal to the Dauphin Charles, the legitimate heir, and the powerful Burgundians, who, led by John the Fearless and later Philip the Good, sought greater autonomy and often allied with England against the Armagnacs. The brutal assassination of Duke Louis of Orleans, the Armagnac leader, in 1407 by agents of the Duke of Burgundy had escalated this internal conflict to an unprecedented level of bitterness and vendetta, deeply fragmenting French power. Henry V's first major campaign culminated in the legendary Battle of Agincourt in 1415. An English army of around 6,090 men, severely depleted by disease dysentery, after a lengthy siege of Honfleur, found itself vastly outnumbered by possibly 20, 0 French. Though numbers are debated, Henry V's tactical brilliance was on full display. He deployed his longbowmen strategically on the flanks between wedges of dismounted men-at-arms in a narrow and muddy defile, a recently plowed field that had turned into a quagmire after heavy rain. The English also sharpened stakes and planted them facing the French, creating an improvised barrier against cavalry. The French, despite their numerical superiority, repeated the tactical blunders of Crécy and Poitiers. Their charges were disorganized, piecemeal, and hampered by the narrow terrain and treacherous mud, which bogged down their heavily armored knights, making them exhausted and vulnerable targets for arrows and subsequent close-quarters combat. The relentless hail of English arrows shredded the French formations, and those who managed to reach the English lines were too spent to fight effectively. The sheer weight of numbers, paradoxically, worked against the French, as many knights became trapped, suffocated, and ridden down in the mud, creating a horrific pile of bodies. In a controversial and brutal act, fearing the counterattack from French reserves, and with his small army stretched, Henry V ordered the massacre of thousands of French prisoners, a shocking act that was later justified by him as a military necessity, but which remains a dark stain on his reputation. Agincourt was a colossal and humiliating defeat for France, annihilating a significant portion of its remaining aristocracy and leaving its military leadership in utter disarray. It paved the way for Henry V's systematic and methodical conquest of Normandy over the next 5 years. Following Agincourt, Henry V systematically besieged and captured key cities throughout Normandy, including the vital capital of Rouen, 1419, which endured a long and brutal siege. His relentless military successes, combined with the ongoing and escalating French Civil War, exacerbated by the highly controversial assassination of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy in 1419 during a meeting with the Dauphin Charles, which solidified Burgundy's alignment with England for revenge, forced the mentally unstable French King Charles VI to sign the deeply humiliating Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This treaty, a profound blow to French sovereignty, declared Charles VI's son, the Dauphin Charles, illegitimate and disinherited from the French throne. Crucially, it stipulated that Henry V would marry Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and that their future son would inherit the crowns of both England and France upon Charles VI's death, effectively uniting the two kingdoms under a single Anglo-French monarchy. For a brief, dizzying period, it appeared that England had finally achieved its ultimate objective, the creation of a unified Anglo-French monarchy. Indeed, upon the deaths of both Henry V and Charles VI in 1422, within months of each other, likely from dysentery, their infant son, Henry VI, was proclaimed King of England and France. Regents governed both kingdoms. John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's brother, ably and effectively administered English-held France, a domination Anglaise or dual monarchy, while Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, managed affairs in England. The formidable English-Burgundian alliance controlled vast swaths of northern France, including the symbolic capital of Paris, and the strategic Loire Valley was largely open to English invasion. The English had established a sophisticated administrative system in Normandy, attempting to integrate it into their dual monarchy. However, just as English victory seemed inevitable and irreversible, an extraordinary and almost miraculous figure emerged to fundamentally alter the course of the war: Joan of Arc. A devout peasant girl from the obscure village of Domremy in Lorraine, she claimed to experience vivid divine visions and voices, primarily from Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, instructing her to save France, raise the siege of Orleans, and ensure the coronation of the disinherited Dauphin, Charles VII. Her story, a blend of profound faith, unwavering conviction, raw charisma, and uncanny strategic insight, captured the imagination of a weary and demoralized French populace who saw themselves as abandoned by God. Against all odds and the profound skepticism of Charles VII's own advisors, who subjected her to rigorous theological examinations in Poitiers, looking for signs of heresy or madness, she convinced the Dauphin to allow her to lead troops to relieve the critical siege of Orléans in 1429. Her leadership, characterized by audacious assaults and a fearless presence on the front lines, despite being wounded, inspired the French to new heights of courage. Her success in breaking the siege was a profound turning point, seen as a genuine miracle by the French and a clear sign of divine disfavor by the English. Following Orléans, Joan insisted on the Dauphin's coronation at Reims, the traditional crowning place for French kings, deep within English-held territory. This audacious act, accomplished against great odds, and through a daring march through enemy lines, formally legitimized Charles VII's claim to the throne in the eyes of many French people, transforming him from a weak king of Bourges, his temporary seat of power in the Loire Valley, into the divinely sanctioned King of France. Joan's brief but intensely impactful military career, including successes at the Battle of Patay in 1429, injected a powerful spiritual and national fervor into a weary French population, galvanizing their resistance. Despite her profound influence, Joan was tragically captured by Burgundian forces in Compiègne in 1430, sold to the English for a hefty sum of 10 livres, subsequently subjected to a politically motivated ecclesiastical trial orchestrated by pro-English French clergy under Bishop Pierre Cauchon. Accused of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, which she defended as a necessary protection during her military life, she was repeatedly interrogated for months without legal counsel, enduring immense psychological pressure. Despite retracting a confession under duress, she later reasserted her divine mission, leading to her condemnation. She was brutally burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431 at the age of 19. Her cruel death, intended by the English to discredit her and break French morale, instead solidified her image as a martyr and a potent, enduring symbol of French resistance and national identity. Her legacy profoundly shaping the final phase of the war and later inspiring French nationalism for centuries. Her rehabilitation trial in 1456 reversed the verdict, declaring her innocent. Inspired by Joan's example and under Charles VII's increasingly confident and politically astute leadership, the French crown initiated a series of crucial military and political reforms that would prove decisive in turning the tide. Centralized professional army, Charles VII systematically reformed the French military structure, moving away from the unreliable and often disruptive feudal levy system and mercenary bands. The creation of the Compagnies d'Ordonnance in 1445 established a truly professional, standing royal army, directly paid, trained, and controlled by the crown. These companies consisted of highly trained men-at-arms, archers, and squires, forming a disciplined and reliable fighting force, a revolutionary concept for its time that dramatically increased the king's power relative to the nobility. Artillery companies were integrated into this force, and specialized infantry, such as the Franks archers after 1448, peasant archers exempted from tax, were developed, though the Franks archers proved less successful and were later replaced by more professional infantry. Artillery mastery, France invested heavily in the development and deployment of gunpowder artillery. French engineers, notably the Bureau brothers, Jean and Gaspard, developed more efficient, lighter, and more powerful cannons, improved gunpowder formulations, and refined siege techniques to rapidly breach even the most formidable stone walls. This new technology proved devastatingly effective, allowing the French to systematically breach and recapture English-held castles and fortified towns that had previously been considered impregnable. The Great Bombard and other large siege guns became the key to breaking English strongholds. Financial reforms. Charles VII's reign saw crucial reforms to the French royal finances. By establishing permanent royal taxation, like the taille on the peasantry, which was levied without regular consent from the Estates General, he secured a stable and consistent revenue stream necessary to fund the new standing army and the increasingly expensive artillery trade. This reduced the crown's reliance on extraordinary feudal aids and loans, giving the monarchy unprecedented financial independence. The Burgundian Reconciliation, 1435, a critical diplomatic triumph for Charles VII, occurred at the Congress of Arras in 1435. Through astute negotiation, significant concessions, including an apology for John the Fearless's assassination, though Charles VII denied direct involvement, and the recognition of Burgundy's growing power, Charles VII persuaded Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, to abandon his long-standing and crucial English alliance and reconcile with the French crown. This reconciliation was a devastating blow to the English war effort, isolating them on the continent and denying them their most powerful and influential ally, effectively sealing their eventual defeat. The death of the Duke of Bedford, the capable English regent, just after Arras further weakened the English position. The slow, grinding French reconquest of their lost territories continued relentlessly. City after city, castle after castle fell to the revitalized French army, often through efficient siege operations utilizing their superior artillery. The English, plagued by financial exhaustion, increasingly severe internal political divisions, the nascent stirrings of what would become the Wars of the Roses, with factions vying for control of the young and ineffective King Henry VI, and a lack of fresh reinforcements, found themselves increasingly on the defensive, unable to hold their vast and expensive French possessions. The final major battle of the war was the Battle of Castillon in 1453. Fought in Gascony, where the English still held some influence and popular support, this engagement was a watershed moment in military history. An English army of around 6,000 men, under the veteran commander John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, attempting to relieve the besieged town of Castillon, marched directly into a well-prepared French artillery park. The French cannons, numbering around 300, positioned behind a defensive ditch and palisade, decimated the English forces with concentrated fire before they could even effectively engage the French infantry. Talbot himself was killed, marking the end of significant English military resistance on the continent. Castillon is widely considered the first major battle in European history where artillery played the decisive role in determining the outcome, rendering traditional shock tactics obsolete. This crushing defeat marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War, securing definitive French control over Gascony and reducing English possessions on the continent to just the Pale of Calais, which they would hold until 1558. The enduring aftermath. a transformed Europe and a new world order. The Hundred Years' War, in its immense duration and widespread, multifaceted impact, irrevocably altered the course of both England and France, and indeed, the broader landscape of European history. Its legacy permeated every aspect of society, politics, and culture, shaping the trajectory of the nascent modern era. For France, the birth of a unified nation, state, and the rise of royal absolutism, the war was a cataclysm that ultimately acted as a powerful catalyst for profound national transformation. It systematically eroded the power of the feudal nobility, who suffered massive casualties on battlefields and saw their lands confiscated for disloyalty or inability to resist English invasion. Many of the old princely appanages, lands granted to royal princes, were recovered by the crown, further centralizing power. The French monarchy emerged vastly strengthened, consolidating its authority. The crown's newfound ability to impose direct, permanent taxation, such as the taille on the peasantry, which was levied without regular consent from the Estates General, gradually diminishing their power to maintain a standing professional army independent of fickle feudal levies, were essential steps towards the absolute monarchy that would characterize France for centuries. This shift from a fragmented feudal realm to a more centralized state laid the bedrock for Louis XI's consolidation of power and subsequent French expansion and influence in Europe. The shared, prolonged struggle against a common, foreign enemy fostered a profound and enduring sense of Frenchness that transcended traditional, regional, and feudal loyalties. The heroic narrative of Joan of Arc became a powerful, unifying myth, symbolizing divine favor, national resilience, and common purpose, permanently embedding itself in the collective consciousness and fostering a nascent nationalism that would grow stronger over time. While initially devastated, the cessation of hostilities allowed France to embark on a period of vigorous reconstruction and economic recovery. The centralized monarchy streamlined administration, unified legal systems, and fostered trade, creating a more cohesive national economy and contributing to national prosperity. The modernization of the military, particularly the professionalization of the army and the adoption of gunpowder artillery, positioned France as a formidable military power in Europe, a trajectory that would continue for centuries, profoundly influencing subsequent European conflicts and the balance of power. The war also saw the emergence of a new class of royal administrators and lawyers, often drawn from the bourgeoisie, who were loyal to the crown rather than to feudal lords, further strengthening central government. For England, an island nation's redefinition and the seeds of internal strife, the humiliating loss of its vast continental empire forced England to abandon its long-cherished dream of a continental dominion. This led to a profound strategic reorientation, turning England's focus inward towards its island identity and then outward towards maritime exploration, naval supremacy, and eventual global colonial expansion. This redefinition contributed significantly to the formation of a unique English identity, distinct from continental European affairs, fostering a sense of insular pride and a greater emphasis on naval power. However, the immediate aftermath of the war was tumultuous. The humiliation of defeat in France, the immense economic strain of financing the conflict, leading to royal debt and financial crisis, and the return of large numbers of unemployed and often unruly professional soldiers, many of whom knew no other trade than warfare, forming retinues for ambitious lords, exacerbated existing internal political rivalries. The underlying dynastic tensions between the House of Lancaster, holding the throne, and the House of York, coupled with the discontent of dispossessed nobles and powerful magnates, like Richard, Duke of York, exploded into the devastating Wars of the Roses, 1487. This protracted dynastic civil war ravaged England for over 30 years, decimating much of the old aristocracy, leading to further social and economic disruption, and ultimately culminating in the rise of the centralized Tudor dynasty under Henry VII, who would establish a stronger, more stable monarchy. Ironically, the Crown's continuous need for funds to finance the prolonged war strengthened the role of Parliament. Kings were forced to convene Parliament more frequently to secure grants of taxation, which in turn gave Parliament, especially the House of Commons, which represented the gentry and merchants, greater leverage and influence over royal policy. This laid important groundwork for England's unique constitutional development, distinct from the path of French absolutism, where the Estates General largely lost its power. Culturally, the war played a significant role in the decline of Norman French as the language of the English court, law, and elite, which had been dominant since the Norman conquest. Middle English gained ascendance, solidifying its place as the national language and contributing to a more distinct English literary tradition exemplified by figures like Geoffrey Chaucer, whose works reflect the linguistic and social changes of the era. The shared experience of fighting against a foreign enemy also helped to solidify a sense of common English identity, often expressed through anti-French sentiment, broader European transformations, and enduring legacies. The Hundred Years' War, alongside the cataclysmic impact of the Black Death, profoundly impacted the decline of feudalism across Western Europe. The heavy casualties among the nobility, the rising cost of warfare, which favored monarchs with greater financial resources over feudal lords, and the increasing reliance on paid professional armies diminished the power and relevance of the traditional feudal levy system. Many nobles went bankrupt trying to maintain their own forces or pay ransoms, further centralizing power in royal hands. The war unequivocally marked a military revolution. The innovations in weaponry, the longbow's early dominance, followed by the decisive impact of gunpowder artillery, from primitive bombards to more mobile, specialized cannons like the culverin and serpentine, and tactics, the rise of professional, disciplined infantry formations over cavalry, the importance of logistics, and sophisticated siege engineering fundamentally transformed warfare, leading to larger, more centralized, and technologically advanced military forces across the continent. This shift signaled the beginning of the end for the age of the chivalric knight, whose effectiveness was increasingly challenged by new weapons and tactics. The complexity and unprecedented duration of the conflict spurred the development of more sophisticated diplomatic practices, including the emergence of permanent ambassadors, more formal treaty negotiations, and alliances based on shifting strategic interests rather than purely dynastic ties. This laid some of the groundwork for the modern system of international relations, moving towards a more state-centric approach. Architecturally, the war's later stages demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional medieval castles to gunpowder artillery, prompting the evolution of new forms of fortification. This led to the development of lower, thicker walls, round towers, and later, the star-shaped bastions designed to deflect and absorb cannon fire, profoundly influencing Renaissance and early modern military architecture. The war also left an enduring mark on popular culture and collective memory. Chronicles such as those by Jean Froissart from the English, Burgundian perspective, and Enguerrand de Monstrelet from a later French perspective, ballads, epic poems, and later literary works from both nations were deeply shaped by the experiences and tragedies of the conflict, fostering narratives of heroism, victimhood, and national destiny that continue to resonate through the centuries. The memory of Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and Orléans remains potent symbols in both English and French historical consciousness. Furthermore, the immense economic pressures of the war led to innovations in taxation and finance. Kings sought new ways to raise revenue, often through parliamentary grants in England and more direct royal levies in France, accelerating the development of national fiscal systems. The reliance on loans from Italian, e.g., Bardi and Peruzzi families, and German bankers also grew, laying groundwork for future financial independence and the rise of international finance. The chronic problems of mercenaries and free companies, bands of demobilized soldiers who terrorized the countryside during truces, also prompted states to find ways to control or integrate them, further leading to the development of standing armies. The war's devastation led to significant population displacement, destruction of infrastructure, and changes in land use, with some areas taking generations to recover fully. Yet, it also spurred innovation in agriculture in some regions to cope with labor shortages, leading to increased efficiency. The Hundred Years' War was not merely a series of battles. It was a societal crucible that burned for over a century, consuming lives, reshaping landscapes, and ultimately forging the very nations we recognize today. It was a testament to human endurance, adaptation, and the relentless, often brutal march of change. The profound rivalry born during this century of conflict would echo for centuries, defining the relationship between England and France, influencing their respective paths of development and shaping the broader trajectory of Western civilization itself. Every single detail, every dot of that 116-year struggle, from the grand strategic shifts and intricate diplomatic machinations to the individual acts of heroism, suffering, and despair, contributed to the colossal, transformative tapestry of change that forever altered the face of Europe and laid the foundations for the early modern world, the reverberations of which can still be felt in the political and cultural identities of both nations even today.